Hello, welcome to Food for Thought, Thinking with Jesus. We're in John's Gospel, and we're watching the way Jesus discipled his very first disciples. It was really quite simple, but deeply, deeply profound, the way he discipled this first group. Every day they awakened in his presence. They would see him, hear him, learn to love him because he first loved them, so they could live his life out into the world. It's really a beautiful understanding of what discipleship is. I remember when I first became a follower of Jesus Christ in 1967, that I remember the people recommending that I read the Gospel of John. And so I did, and I've been reading it ever since. But even now, after so many years of reading the Gospel of John, I cannot get enough of this story of Jesus Christ, who he is, what he said, what he did, why he did it. It just is so deeply satisfying. It satisfies a very deep hunger in me to have meaning, to have purpose, to have life. And I think that's what Jesus means here in John chapter 6 when he says, "He who believes in me will never hunger, will never thirst." I have never been hungry for meaning apart from Jesus. Every time I have eaten from his life, I've found meaning and purpose. And so it is true that whoever believes in Jesus will never hunger and never thirst. I heard a very famous, internationally known psychologist say recently, whoever has the best story wins. He was talking about the situation going on in the world and how dependent we as human beings are with narratives, and how we are dependent on a story about life that inspires us, or what we believe the real goal of life is. This particular psychologist said that we should all aim at the highest thing that we know. And for those of us who are believers in Jesus Christ, that highest is Jesus Christ. And I have found over my walk of many, many years with Jesus that when I am immersed in the story of who he is and what he said and what he does, I am profoundly and deeply fed. And my thirst for meaning is completely satisfied. Let's go to verse 41, and we'll see this picture of the story and how Jesus' story becomes our story, becomes our life, becomes our food, becomes our drink. The Jews then complained about him because he said, "I am the bread which came down from heaven." And they said, "Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that he says, 'I have come down from heaven'?" You see what they're doing? They're trying to limit his story. They're saying, hey, his story is no different than our story. We know his father. We know his mother. Why in the world is he trying to say that he has a story that goes all the way back to heaven with the presence of God? Now listen to how Jesus answers this. Jesus therefore answered and said to them, "Do not murmur among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And I will raise him up in the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me." Now go back to the idea of who has the best story wins. The Father is the one who draws us to Jesus by teaching us about him. Not that anyone has seen the Father except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. Most assuredly, I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is an interesting statement. Your fathers, and they kept talking about Moses, and he'd given them the bread, and he said, no, it was my Father who gave the bread. He said, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead, meaning their story stopped. The story that they lived about being fed in the wilderness had a beginning and it had an end. Now listen what he says. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. So he says, it's true, you have the story in their history, the history of the nation of Israel, of a time when manna came down from heaven because the Father gave it, not Moses. And those people ate that bread and then they died, meaning that bread was not able to keep them alive. And he says this, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, now he's talking about his life, his story, his meaning, his love. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. The story of Jesus has been called the greatest story ever told. But also it's the greatest story ever lived. And that's what separates a disciple from a non-disciple. It's that we live in the story of Jesus, from the story of Jesus, from the life of Jesus. We abide in his life, we abide in his love, and we are in this story with him. To be a disciple is to be in the story with Jesus. For us, we are still living Jesus. We are in this story. The Father drew us to Jesus. He puts us into Jesus. And then we feed on this story. We feed and drink from this life. We believe. That's our work. Our work is to believe on the one the Father sent. And when we center our lives in this story, in this person, in this narrative, in this history, the one who lived and died and was buried and rose from the dead, when we live this story, we never hunger and we never thirst for a better story. We never hunger, we never thirst for something else to give us meaning or purpose. I've been in this walk with Jesus now for a long time, and I can say this, that every time I get thirsty for meaning, thirsty for purpose, thirsty for being loved, all I need to do is return to Jesus, to believe. That's my work. And when I am satisfied in Jesus, then all the other things God provides. Jesus satisfies the hunger for meaning, for eternity, for transcendence. Whoever has the best story wins. We, Christians, have the story. Not just the best story, but the true story. The Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Then Jesus said, most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Now let's look at it like this. If you do not internalize the story of the crucifixion, and if you do not drink of the blood of his sacrifice, meaning if you do not immerse yourself in his life, and if you do not have his life in you, then you have no life in you. It really comes back to what is the story, what is the narrative that you actually believe about God, about how God is full of grace and truth. What is the story that you believe? What is the story that I believe? People today are lined up to go to theaters to hear about heroes and stories and the Marvel comic books, and people are hanging on everything they can find on YouTube or the internet to keep something going on in their life that maybe they can believe in and live for and maybe even be willing to die for. But we as Christians, we have stepped into the story of God's will being done among us by the Word who became flesh. And if we will eat and drink the life and blood of Jesus, and you do that, by living in the story. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. For to me to live is Christ, and to die, even die physically, is gain. That comes from this story. You say, oh, it's not just a story. I don't mean story as if it's a fable. I'm talking about an actual flesh and blood history that you have to eat and drink to be a disciple. He goes on and said, for my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I am in him. If you do not eat and drink the story and the life of Jesus, and if that is not your primary source of inspiration and motivation and purpose, then you're not abiding in him. As the Father sent me, and as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So he who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever. If we are not eating and drinking the story and the reality of the person of Jesus, we will not live. For to me to live is Christ. I was crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives on me. These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Now listen what happens here. It's really interesting. Therefore, many of his disciples, and these are not the 12, but the others who were gathered near him as well. Therefore, many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a hard saying. Who can understand it? And many of his disciples at this point stopped following him. And this is where many disciples stop following. When we read him and hear him saying, you must eat and drink of my real story, real life, and it must become the story that is your story, and it is the story that you live and die for, no matter what other story comes along, no matter what other people say, no matter what the price may be that you pay for living in this story, you would say, for to me to live is Christ. This is my story. This is my song. This is what keeps me living. It's the story of Jesus. This is far different than church attendance. This is far different than simply going to a Bible study occasionally. This is far different than simply going, well, yeah, I'm a Christian. No, it's far beyond that. And Jesus forces that on every one of us. And at some point in time, we have to be all in this story. And we have to die to the other stories. And we have to take up our cross. And we have to follow him as the continuation of this story. I believe the psychologist was right who said, who has the best story wins. And the best story is the true story of the love of God expressed in Jesus. And it overcame the world. And our faith can also overcome the world if that faith is in Jesus. It's incredible content in John chapter 6, but it is shocking content. Make no mistake, it is a dividing place, a place where you must position yourself. What is the story that will feed you and satisfy your thirst? Give some thought to these things. They're worth thinking about. They must be thought about. God bless you. Have a great day in Jesus.